Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who looks like they don't belong there at all. In a world where respect is earned through fear and intimidation, what happens when someone quietly possesses skills that could end lives in seconds, but chooses to remain invisible? This is the story of Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, a woman whose unassuming appearance masked years of the most brutal military training known to mankind. When a group of cocky military cadets decided to play a cruel prank on what they thought was just another weak female instructor, they had no idea they were about to learn the most important lesson of their military careers. Some lessons in respect come through words and wisdom. Others come when you realize the person you're threatening could have killed you 7 different ways before you even finished drawing your weapon. This isn't just a story about military training or gender dynamics. It's about the moment when reality crashes into assumptions, when experience meets arrogance, and when true strength reveals itself not through aggression, but through the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're capable of. What happened next would change not just those cadets' lives, but reshape the entire culture of one of America's most prestigious military academies forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Blackwater Military Academy as Lieutenant Sarah Martinez walked quietly toward the main training facility. Her footsteps made barely a sound on the concrete, a habit ingrained from years of moving through hostile territory where the difference between silence and noise meant the difference between life and death. To any observer, she looked like just another instructor heading to work, perhaps even younger and smaller than most of the cadets she was supposed to be training. At 5 feet 4 inches and weighing only 125 pounds, Sarah didn't fit the typical image of what people expected from a military instructor. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her uniform, while perfectly pressed and regulation, somehow seemed to hang loose on her small frame. She wore no visible decorations or ribbons that would immediately indicate her background, as was often the case with special operations personnel who preferred to keep their accomplishments private. The academy bustled with its usual morning activity. Cadets marched in formation across the grounds, their boots striking the pavement in synchronized rhythm. The sound echoed off the brick buildings that had stood for over a century, housing generations of future military officers. Blackwater had a reputation for producing some of the finest leaders in the armed forces, but it also had another reputation that was whispered about in quieter circles. It was known for its old-fashioned attitudes toward women in combat roles, attitudes that some of the faculty and cadets stubbornly clung to despite changing times. Sarah had been assigned to Blackwater just 3 weeks earlier, tasked with developing and implementing new close-quarters combat training protocols. Her assignment had come directly from the Pentagon, though the details of why she specifically had been chosen were kept deliberately vague in her official paperwork. The Academy's administration had been told only that she was a decorated veteran with extensive combat experience and expertise in advanced tactical training methods. As she entered the main building, Sarah noticed the familiar pattern of behavior she had encountered since arriving. Conversations stopped when she walked by. Cadets would glance at her with barely concealed skepticism, some whispering comments that they thought she couldn't hear. The female cadets seemed curious but cautious, while many of the male cadets displayed attitudes ranging from dismissive to openly hostile. The previous week had been particularly challenging. During her first training demonstration, a group of senior cadets had openly questioned her qualifications. One cadet, a tall, broad-shouldered young man named Jackson Mills, had even gone so far as to suggest that perhaps she should stick to teaching first aid or administrative duties rather than combat techniques. The comment had drawn snickers from his friends and uncomfortable silence from the rest of the group. Sarah had handled the situation with characteristic calm, simply noting the cadet's name and continuing with her demonstration. She had learned long ago that responding to such provocations with anger or defensiveness only reinforced the stereotypes these individuals held. Instead, she preferred to let her work speak for itself, though she knew that approach took time to be effective. The hallways of Blackwater were lined with portraits of distinguished alumni, most of them stern-faced men in military dress uniforms. Their painted eyes seemed to watch as Sarah made her way to her office, a small room tucked away in the basement level of the training building. The location itself seemed deliberately chosen to minimize her visibility and influence, though Sarah suspected this was less about practical considerations and more about keeping the female instructor out of sight of important visitors and donors. Her office was spartanly furnished with a simple desk, 2 chairs, and a filing cabinet. The walls were bare except for a motivational poster about teamwork that looked like it had been hanging there for decades. Sarah had chosen not to personalize the space with photos or memorabilia, partly because she preferred minimalism and partly because she knew her time at Blackwater was temporary. She was there to do a job, implement changes, and move on to her next assignment. As she settled at her desk to review the day's training schedule, Sarah reflected on the path that had brought her to this place. Growing up in a working-class family in San Diego, she had always been the smallest kid in her class, often overlooked and underestimated. Her father, a construction worker, had taught her that real strength came not from size or intimidation, but from discipline, preparation, and the willingness to do whatever was necessary when the moment demanded it. She had enlisted in the Navy immediately after high school, driven by a desire to prove herself and serve her country. Her small stature had initially been seen as a disadvantage, but Sarah quickly discovered that it could also be an asset. She was faster and more agile than larger recruits, able to move through tight spaces and present a smaller target profile. More importantly, she possessed an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure and think clearly in chaotic situations. The road to becoming a Navy SEAL had been brutal beyond description. Of the 200 candidates who had started basic underwater demolition/SEAL training with her class, only 23 had graduated. Sarah had been the only woman, a fact that had made her both a trailblazer and a target for additional scrutiny. Every mistake was magnified, every success was minimized or attributed to lowered standards rather than genuine achievement. During the infamous Hell Week, when candidates were subjected to continuous physical and mental stress on less than 4 hours of sleep total, Sarah had watched as men twice her size broke down and quit. She had carried wounded teammates through mud and ice water, completed obstacle courses while other candidates collapsed from exhaustion, and maintained her composure during interrogation exercises designed to break the strongest wills. The instructors had tried everything to make her quit. They had made her carry heavier loads, swim longer distances, and endure verbal abuse specifically designed to target her gender. Through it all, Sarah had simply focused on the next task, the next moment, the next breath. She had learned to find strength not in anger or spite, but in a deep, quiet certainty that she belonged exactly where she was. After graduation, Sarah had been deployed to some of the most dangerous regions in the world. She had conducted covert operations in environments where capture meant torture and death, had eliminated high-value targets in operations so classified that their details would never see the light of day. She had saved the lives of teammates and civilian populations, had gathered intelligence that prevented terrorist attacks, and had served with a distinction that earned her commendations from the highest levels of military command. But, perhaps more importantly than any individual mission or accomplishment, Sarah had learned to see people clearly. Years of operating in hostile environments had taught her to read body language, voice patterns, and behavioral tells with almost psychic accuracy. She could spot a threat from across a crowded room, identify the most dangerous person in any group, and assess tactical situations with the kind of instant clarity that kept her and her teammates alive. That ability was serving her well at Blackwater, where she could see the dynamics playing out around her with perfect clarity. She understood that the resistance she faced wasn't really about her personally, but about what she represented to people whose worldview depended on maintaining certain hierarchies and assumptions. She also understood that some of the cadets' behavior was crossing lines that would not be tolerated in real military operations, and that intervention would eventually be necessary. As Sarah reviewed her notes from the previous week's training sessions, she noticed patterns in the cadets' behavior that concerned her. A core group of about 8 senior cadets, led by Jackson Mills and his closest friend Marcus Thompson, had been consistently disruptive during her classes. They arrived late, made sarcastic comments during demonstrations, and encouraged younger cadets to adopt similarly disrespectful attitudes. More troubling was intelligence she had gathered from other instructors and staff members about activities happening outside of official training hours. There were reports of hazing incidents targeting female cadets, unauthorized alcohol consumption in the dormitories, and a general culture of entitlement among certain groups of cadets who seemed to believe that their family connections or financial backgrounds made them immune to normal military discipline. The Academy's administration was aware of these issues but seemed reluctant to take strong action. Several faculty members had confided in Sarah that they felt pressure from donors and alumni to maintain the Academy's traditional culture, even when that culture conflicted with modern military standards and values. The result was an environment where problem behaviors were overlooked or minimized, allowing them to escalate over time. Sarah had been documenting these incidents carefully, building a comprehensive picture of the cultural problems at Blackwater. She knew that real change would require more than just new training protocols, it would require a fundamental shift in attitudes and expectations. The question was whether the change would come through gradual education and leadership development, or whether it would require a more dramatic catalyst. As she finished her morning preparation and gathered her materials for the day's training session, Sarah had no way of knowing that the catalyst was already in motion. Jackson Mills and his group had been planning something for several days, something they believed would finally put the undersized female instructor in her place and restore what they saw as the natural order of things at Blackwater. The plan they had devised was crude and dangerous, born from a combination of arrogance, resentment, and a fundamental misunderstanding of who they were dealing with. They had no idea that their intended victim possessed skills that could neutralize armed threats in ways they couldn't imagine. They couldn't have known that Sarah Martinez had survived encounters with some of the most dangerous people on Earth, and that she had developed an almost supernatural ability to turn apparent weakness into devastating strength. Most importantly, they failed to understand that true warriors don't achieve their status through intimidation or showboating, but through quiet competence and the willingness to do whatever is necessary to protect others and accomplish their mission. They were about to learn that lesson in the most direct and unforgettable way possible. As Sarah walked toward the training facility where Jackson's group was waiting, she moved with the same quiet confidence that had carried her through countless dangerous missions. She had no idea what the cadets had planned, but years of experience had taught her to be ready for anything. Whatever was about to happen would become a defining moment not just for those involved, but for the entire culture of Blackwater Military Academy. The tactical training facility was located in a separate building behind the main academy complex, a modern structure filled with simulation equipment and practice areas designed to replicate real combat environments. Sarah arrived 15 minutes before the scheduled training session, as was her habit, to ensure everything was properly set up and to mentally prepare for whatever challenges the day might bring. The facility was unusually quiet as she entered through the main doors. Normally, cadets would already be gathering in small groups, checking equipment and engaging in the kind of nervous chatter that preceded intense physical training. Instead, she found the main training floor completely empty, though she could hear voices coming from one of the smaller side rooms typically used for classroom instruction. Sarah's instincts immediately sharpened. Years of operating in hostile environments had taught her to recognize when something was off, and everything about this situation felt wrong. The timing, the location of the voices, even the quality of light filtering through the windows seemed different from what she had expected. She moved forward cautiously, her footsteps silent on the rubberized flooring. As she approached the source of the voices, Sarah could make out individual words and phrases. Jackson Mills was speaking in the confident, commanding tone he typically used when addressing his followers. She heard mentions of teaching lessons, putting people in their place, and showing everyone how things really worked in the military. The language was coded but unmistakably hostile, and Sarah realized that whatever the cadets had planned was about to unfold. Rather than retreat or immediately call for backup, Sarah chose to continue forward. She had faced down armed terrorists and enemy soldiers in situations far more dangerous than anything a group of cadets could devise. More importantly, she understood that sometimes the best way to handle a bad situation was to walk directly into it and force it to resolution rather than allowing it to fester and potentially escalate. The voices grew clearer as she approached the doorway to the side room. Jackson Mills was indeed holding court with his usual group of followers. Marcus Thompson stood beside him, along with cadets Robert Chan, David Williams, Michael Rodriguez, Kevin O'Brien, Tyler Brooks, and James Patterson. 8 young men who had convinced themselves that their temporary positions at a military academy gave them some kind of real authority or power. Sarah paused just outside the doorway, using techniques she had learned in reconnaissance training to gather intelligence before making her presence known. The cadets were discussing their plan in detail, apparently confident that they wouldn't be overheard or interrupted. What she heard made her blood run cold, not from fear, but from anger at the sheer stupidity and recklessness of what they intended to do. The plan was simple in its crudity. They had obtained training weapons from the Academy's armory, realistic replicas that looked and felt exactly like actual firearms but were designed for simulation exercises. Their intention was to surround Sarah when she entered the room, point the weapons at her, and force her to admit that she had no business training real soldiers. They planned to record the entire encounter on their phones, believing it would serve as proof of her unfitness for the position. What made the plan particularly dangerous was that they had modified some of the training weapons to remove the bright orange markings that clearly identified them as non-lethal simulation equipment. To anyone not examining the weapons closely, they would appear to be real firearms. In any actual military or law enforcement context, such a scenario would be treated as a legitimate armed threat requiring immediate and, potentially lethal response. The cadets had no understanding of the legal and practical implications of what they were planning. They saw it as an elaborate prank, a way to humiliate someone they viewed as an illegitimate authority figure. They had no comprehension that they were about to threaten someone who had been trained to respond to armed threats with overwhelming and decisive force, someone whose reflexes had been honed through years of actual combat experience. Sarah listened as Jackson outlined the specific roles each cadet would play. Thompson and Chen would position themselves by the door to prevent her from leaving. Williams and Rodriguez would flank her from the sides. Mills himself would take the central position, with the others arranged to create a complete circle of apparent weapons pointed directly at her. They had even practiced the timing to ensure they could all draw and aim simultaneously for maximum psychological impact. As she processed this information, Sarah found herself experiencing the same cold, focused clarity that had served her in countless dangerous situations. Her heart rate slowed rather than accelerated, her breathing became deeper and more controlled, and her mind began automatically calculating distances, angles, and response options. The transformation was so complete and so practiced that it happened almost without conscious thought. She realized that she was facing a teaching moment far more significant than anything she could have planned or orchestrated. These cadets were about to learn lessons about respect, authority, and the consequences of poor judgment that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. More importantly, the incident would provide an opportunity to address the broader cultural problems at Blackwater Academy in a way that no amount of gradual reform could accomplish. Sarah also understood that how she handled the next few minutes would determine not just the immediate outcome, but the long-term impact on everyone involved. She could retreat and report the incident, which would likely result in the cadets being disciplined but might also allow them to claim they had been treated unfairly. She could call for backup and overwhelm them with superior numbers, which would resolve the immediate threat but might not create the kind of learning experience that would produce lasting change. Or she could walk into that room alone and demonstrate exactly why their assumptions about her were not just wrong, but dangerously misguided. She could show them what real authority looked like, what actual competence meant, and why respect in military organizations was earned through proven ability rather than demanded through intimidation. The decision was made almost instantly. Sarah adjusted her posture, checked the position of her gear, and mentally rehearsed the sequence of movements she would need to execute. Years of training had taught her that the key to handling multiple armed opponents was speed, precision, and the element of surprise. The cadets were expecting to shock and overwhelm her with their coordinated display of weapons. Instead, they were about to discover what happened when someone with real training decided to end a threat permanently. She took one final moment to center herself, calling upon the mental techniques that had kept her alive and effective through countless dangerous missions. Fear, anger, and ego had no place in what was about to happen. This was simply a tactical problem that required a tactical solution, executed with the kind of professional competence that separated genuine warriors from pretenders. Sarah stepped into the doorway and immediately assessed the situation. The cadets were positioned exactly as she had heard them planning, arranged in a loose circle around the center of the room. Jackson Mills stood directly opposite the entrance, his modified training weapon held at his side but ready to be raised. The others were similarly positioned, some already gripping their weapons, others reaching for them as they noticed her arrival. For just a moment, there was perfect silence in the room. The cadets had been so focused on their preparation that her actual appearance caught them off guard. Jackson Mills recovered first, his face breaking into the kind of confident smirk that he probably thought looked intimidating but actually revealed just how young and inexperienced he really was. Well, he said, his voice carrying the forced bravado of someone trying to convince himself as much as his audience. Look what we have here. The tough lady instructor, all alone with no backup. His hand moved toward his weapon as he spoke, and Sarah could see the others beginning to follow his lead. What happened next would be analyzed and discussed for years afterward by military instructors, psychologists, and tactical experts. But, in that moment, it was simply a demonstration of what happened when theoretical knowledge met practical reality, when assumptions encountered facts, and when inexperience tried to challenge genuine expertise. Sarah's response was so swift and precise that most of the cadets didn't even understand what had happened until it was completely over. Years of training had compressed her reaction time to a level that seemed almost superhuman to anyone who hadn't witnessed similar demonstrations before. In the space of less than 3 seconds, she transformed from an apparently vulnerable target into an overwhelming and irresistible force. The first cadet to raise his weapon found himself on the floor before he had fully processed the fact that she was moving. The second discovered that his weapon was no longer in his hands and that he was experiencing a level of pain he had never imagined possible. The third had just enough time to realize that something had gone terribly wrong before he too joined his friends on the ground. Jackson Mills, who had initiated the entire incident, found himself facing a choice he had never anticipated making. He could continue with his original plan and likely experience the same fate as his friends, or he could acknowledge that he had fundamentally misunderstood the situation from the beginning. The decision was made for him when he found himself looking down the barrel of his own weapon, which had somehow ended up in Sarah's hands without him remembering how it had gotten there. The entire room had been transformed in a matter of seconds. Where moments before there had been 8 confident young men preparing to demonstrate their dominance over a woman they saw as inferior, now there were 8 shocked and subdued individuals beginning to understand that they had made a catastrophic error in judgment. Some were on the ground nursing various injuries, others were standing perfectly still, afraid to move and trigger another demonstration of the skills they had just witnessed. Sarah stood in the center of the room, holding Jackson's weapon with the casual competence of someone for whom such tools were simply extensions of her will. Her breathing was perfectly steady, her posture relaxed but ready, her expression calm and focused. She looked exactly like what she was, a professional warrior who had just dealt with a minor threat and was now considering what lessons needed to be learned from the experience. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the cadets who were still standing seemed afraid to breathe, let alone speak. They were beginning to realize that they had not just attempted to prank a fellow instructor, but had actually threatened someone whose response capabilities were far beyond anything they had imagined possible. The gap between their perception and reality was so vast that they were struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Jackson Mills, still staring at his own weapon in Sarah's hands, finally found his voice. But, instead of the confident commands he had been issuing just minutes before, what came out was a barely audible whisper, "Who are you?" Sarah looked at Jackson Mills for a long moment before responding to his question. The young cadet was still trying to process what had just happened, his face cycling through expressions of confusion, fear, and dawning comprehension. Around the room, his friends were in various states of shock and discomfort, some still on the ground, others standing perfectly still as if movement might trigger another demonstration of capabilities they were only beginning to understand. "I'm exactly who I've been since the day I walked into this academy," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that comes from years of making life and death decisions under pressure. "The question isn't who I am. The question is why you thought it was acceptable to point weapons at an instructor, regardless of who that instructor might be." She moved slowly around the room as she spoke, checking on each of the cadets to ensure that none of them had been seriously injured during her response to their threat. Her movements were economical and purposeful, like a medic triaging casualties or a teacher checking homework. There was nothing theatrical or intimidating about her behavior, which somehow made it even more unsettling to the young men who were realizing how completely they had misjudged the situation. Robert Chen, one of the cadets who had ended up on the floor, was nursing what appeared to be a sprained wrist and trying to understand how he had gotten there. One moment he had been raising his weapon as planned, the next he was looking up at the ceiling with his arm twisted in a way that hurt but wasn't quite injured. The transition had happened so quickly that his memory couldn't fill in the details of how it had occurred. David Williams was experiencing a similar confusion. He distinctly remembered having his weapon in his hands, remembered Jackson giving the signal to raise it, remembered beginning to comply with the plan they had rehearsed. But, somehow his weapon was now on the floor several feet away, and he had a growing bruise on his shoulder that he couldn't explain. The disconnect between his expectations and reality was so complete that he wondered if he might be having some kind of breakdown. Michael Rodriguez had managed to remain standing throughout the encounter, but only because Sarah had chosen to neutralize his threat through pressure point techniques rather than the more dramatic throws and disarms she had used on some of the others. He found himself completely unable to move his right arm, which hung uselessly at his side as if the nerves had simply stopped functioning. The numbness was beginning to be replaced by a tingling sensation that suggested normal function would return, but the experience of losing control of his own body was more terrifying than any physical pain. Tyler Brooks and James Patterson had been positioned near the back of the room and had hesitated a crucial fraction of a second longer than their friends before attempting to raise their weapons. That hesitation had saved them from the immediate physical consequences of their actions, but it also meant they had the clearest view of what Sarah was capable of when she chose to act decisively. Both young men were pale and shaken, finally, beginning to understand that they had not been participating in a prank but in something that could have had genuinely serious consequences. Kevin O'Brien was perhaps the most affected by what had just occurred. As one of the younger cadets in the group, he had been following the lead of the older students without fully thinking through what they were planning. Now, seeing his friends disabled and disarmed so quickly and efficiently, he was beginning to realize that he had been involved in something that went far beyond academy politics or harmless hazing. The look on his face was that of someone whose entire understanding of the world had just been fundamentally challenged. Marcus Thompson, Jackson's closest friend and the co-architect of their plan, was still standing but looked as if he might collapse at any moment. He had always been the more thoughtful of the two leaders, and he was now running through all the ways their scheme could have gone wrong. The legal implications alone were staggering. They had threatened an instructor with weapons, even if those weapons were training replicas. In any real military context, such an action would likely result in court-martial proceedings and possible criminal charges. Sarah completed her circuit of the room and returned to the center, where Jackson Mills was still holding his position with the kind of perfect stillness that comes from not knowing what else to do. She methodically checked each of the training weapons to ensure they were safe, removing magazines and clearing chambers with the practiced efficiency of someone who had handled thousands of firearms throughout her career. The familiar motion seemed to calm her even as they demonstrated yet another level of competence that the cadets hadn't expected. "I want each of you to think very carefully about what just happened here," she said, her voice still calm but carrying an undertone that made it clear she expected their complete attention. "You planned and attempted to carry out an action that, in any operational environment, would have justified the use of lethal force in response. You pointed weapons at another person with the intention of intimidating and humiliating them. The fact that those weapons were training replicas doesn't change the nature of what you attempted to do." She paused to let that information sink in before continuing. "In the military, we have a saying, train like you fight, fight like you train. If you're willing to point a weapon at someone during training, what does that say about your decision-making under real pressure? If you think intimidation and humiliation are acceptable tools for dealing with people you don't respect, how will you treat civilians in a combat zone? How will you treat your own subordinates when you have real authority?" The questions hung in the air like physical weights. None of the cadets seemed prepared to offer answers, perhaps because they were beginning to realize that any honest response would reveal just how poorly they had thought through their actions. The silence stretched on as Sarah gave them time to process not just what had happened, but what it meant for their future careers and their understanding of themselves. Jackson Mills finally managed to speak, though his voice was barely above a whisper. "We didn't mean for it to be real. We just wanted to make a point." "About what?" Sarah asked, her tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than anger. "What point were you trying to make by threatening someone with weapons?" Jackson opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again as he realized he didn't have a good answer. The point had seemed obvious when they were planning the incident. They wanted to show that a small woman had no business trying to teach combat techniques to male cadets. They wanted to demonstrate that there were natural hierarchies that couldn't be overcome through policy changes or political correctness. They wanted to prove that when it came to real physical confrontation, traditional assumptions about strength and dominance would reassert themselves. Instead, they had proven exactly the opposite. They had demonstrated that their assumptions about physical capability were completely wrong. They had shown that their understanding of what constituted real strength was fundamentally flawed. Most importantly, they had revealed that they possessed neither the judgment nor the character required for military leadership. The point, Marcus Thompson said slowly, apparently deciding that someone needed to attempt an explanation, was that we don't think you belong here. We don't think women should be teaching combat techniques to male soldiers. Sarah nodded as if she had expected that answer. I see. And, you felt that the appropriate way to express that opinion was to surround me with weapons and attempt to force me to agree with you? It seemed like... Marcus began, then trailed off as he realized how their actions sounded when described so plainly. It seemed like what? Sarah prompted. It seemed like it would work, Jackson admitted, his voice carrying a note of bewilderment that suggested he was still trying to understand how their plan had failed so completely. Sarah almost smiled at the honesty of that response. It seemed like it would work because you made assumptions about me based on my appearance and your preconceptions about what women are capable of. You didn't bother to learn anything about my background or qualifications. You didn't consider the possibility that your assumptions might be wrong. You certainly didn't think through the consequences of what you were planning to do. She moved to a position where she could make eye contact with each of the cadets as she continued speaking. So let me fill in some of the information you didn't bother to gather. My name is Lieutenant Sarah Martinez. I am a graduate of Basic Underwater Demolition/SEAL Training, Class 297. I have served on active duty for 8 years, with deployments to Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and several other locations that remain classified. I have been awarded the Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars with Valor Devices, and a Purple Heart. I am here at Blackwater because the Pentagon specifically requested that I develop new training protocols based on lessons learned in actual combat operations. The information hit the cadets like a series of physical blows. Several of them had heard of BUD/S training and understood just how elite and difficult the program was. None of them had imagined they were dealing with someone who had not only completed that training but had gone on to serve in actual combat operations. The decorations she mentioned were among the highest awards for valor available to military personnel, indicating that she had not just served but had distinguished herself under the most dangerous possible conditions. Kevin O'Brien, who had been looking increasingly distressed throughout the encounter, suddenly spoke up. Oh God, we're going to be expelled, aren't we? Our careers are over before they even started. It was a reasonable assumption. What they had done would normally result in immediate dismissal from any military academy, along with potential criminal charges. The fact that they were dealing with someone of Sarah's caliber and reputation only made the situation worse. An attack on any instructor would be serious. An attack on a decorated combat veteran would likely result in the harshest possible penalties. But Sarah was already thinking beyond immediate consequences to longer-term outcomes. These 8 cadets had revealed serious character flaws and dangerous decision-making patterns, but they were also young people who might still be capable of learning and growing from their mistakes. The question was whether the lesson should come through punishment or through education, and whether there was a way to achieve both objectives simultaneously. That depends, she said finally, on whether you're capable of learning from this experience and making meaningful changes in your attitudes and behavior. The easy thing for me to do would be to report this incident and let the Academy's disciplinary system handle it. You would be expelled, your military careers would be over, and I would never have to deal with any of you again. She paused to let them consider that possibility before continuing. But I'm not sure that outcome would actually serve anyone's interests. You would learn that there are consequences for bad decisions, but you wouldn't learn why those decisions were wrong or how to make better choices in the future. The Academy would remove a problem, but it wouldn't address the cultural issues that allowed this situation to develop. And the military would lose 8 potential officers who might, with proper guidance, eventually become effective leaders. The cadets exchanged glances, hardly daring to hope that they might be offered an alternative to the disaster their actions had created. Jackson Mills, who had initiated the entire incident, seemed to be struggling with the cognitive dissonance of being offered mercy by someone he had just attempted to humiliate and intimidate. "What kind of alternative are you talking about?" he asked cautiously. "An education," Sarah replied. "A real one. I'm going to teach you what you should have learned before you ever set foot in this academy, what it means to be a soldier, what real strength looks like, and why respect in military organizations is earned rather than demanded." She looked around the room one final time, meeting each cadet's eyes in turn. "But, understand this, if any of you ever threatens another person again, if any of you ever attempts to use intimidation or force to get your way, if any of you ever shows that you haven't learned the lessons I'm about to teach you, then you will discover that what happened here today was just a gentle introduction to what I'm actually capable of." The promise in her words was unmistakable, and every cadet in the room understood that they had just been offered a second chance that they didn't deserve and might never get again. How they responded to that opportunity would determine not just their own futures, but the kind of officers they might eventually become. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the training facility an hour before dawn, as had become her habit since the incident with the cadets. The early morning darkness provided a peaceful environment for reflection and preparation, and she needed both as she considered how to proceed with the most challenging teaching assignment of her career. Transforming 8 hostile and prejudiced young men into effective military officers would require a combination of physical training, psychological insight, and moral education that went far beyond normal academy protocols. She had spent the previous evening researching each cadet's background, academic record, and psychological profile. The information she discovered was both enlightening and troubling. Jackson Mills came from a family with a long military tradition, including a grandfather who had served as a general and a father who was currently a colonel. The pressure to live up to that legacy, combined with a privileged upbringing, had apparently created a sense of entitlement and an assumption that respect was his birthright rather than something to be earned. Marcus Thompson's file revealed a more complex story. He was at Blackwater on a partial scholarship, the son of a single mother who had sacrificed enormously to give him opportunities she had never had. His academic performance was excellent, and his psychological evaluations suggested genuine leadership potential. The fact that he had participated in the weapon incident seemed more about following Jackson's lead than any deep-seated hostility toward female authority figures. The other cadets' backgrounds varied widely, but several patterns emerged. Most came from families with military connections, creating pressure to succeed in an environment they didn't fully understand. Several had attended elite preparatory schools where competition and social hierarchy were emphasized over collaboration and mutual respect. Almost all of them had grown up in environments where they rarely encountered women in positions of real authority, making their adjustment to changing military demographics particularly difficult. As Sarah reviewed this information, she began to develop a comprehensive training program that would address not just the immediate behavioral problems but the underlying attitudes and assumptions that had created them. Traditional military discipline alone wouldn't be sufficient. These cadets needed to experience situations that would fundamentally challenge their worldview and force them to develop new ways of thinking about strength, leadership, and respect. The first phase of her program began at 0500 hours when all 8 cadets reported to the training facility as she had ordered. They arrived looking nervous and uncertain, clearly expecting some form of punishment or public humiliation in retaliation for their actions. Instead, they found Sarah waiting for them in standard physical training gear, looking like she was preparing for a normal workout session. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said, her tone businesslike but not hostile. "We're going to begin your real education today. The first lesson is about what actual strength looks like, as opposed to the performance of strength that you demonstrated yesterday." She led them outside to the Academy's obstacle course, a challenging series of walls, ropes, mud pits, and other barriers designed to test physical capability and mental determination. The course had been designed by military trainers to replicate some of the challenges soldiers might face in actual combat environments, and even experienced cadets often struggled to complete it within the required time limits. "The exercise is simple," Sarah explained. "Each of you will complete the obstacle course carrying a 40-pound pack, which simulates the basic load a soldier carries in combat. However, you will do it as a team. Everyone finishes together, or no one finishes at all. If any member of your team fails to complete an obstacle, the entire team returns to the starting point and begins again. The cadets exchanged glances, recognizing both the physical challenge and the psychological pressure of the team requirement. Jackson Mills, still trying to assert some form of leadership, stepped forward. "What about you? Are you just going to watch us struggle?" Sarah's response was to pick up a pack that appeared to be significantly heavier than the one she had assigned to the cadets. "I'll be completing the course with you, carrying a 60-pound pack. If I finish before all of you do, we start over again. If I fail to complete any obstacle, we start over again. Your success depends on mine, just as mine depends on yours." The implications of this arrangement began to sink in as the cadets realized that Sarah had just made herself both their teammate and their pace setter. If she was as weak and incompetent as they had assumed, they would all fail together. If she was actually capable of carrying more weight and moving faster than any of them, their previous assumptions about physical capability would be thoroughly challenged. The first attempt at the obstacle course was a disaster. Jackson Mills, despite his impressive physical appearance, began struggling with the pack weight before they had completed a quarter of the course. Kevin O'Brien, the youngest and smallest of the group, fell behind early and never caught up. The team dynamics were chaotic, with everyone focused on their own performance rather than supporting their teammates. Sarah, meanwhile, moved through the obstacles with a fluid efficiency that made her pack weight seem irrelevant. She completed each challenge quickly and then waited for the others to catch up, offering occasional technical advice but mostly observing how they handled the stress and frustration of repeated failures. By the time they had made their fifth unsuccessful attempt, several of the cadets were becoming visibly angry. "This is impossible," Tyler Brooks complained during a brief rest period. "She's making us fail on purpose." "How?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about his reasoning. "You're too fast. You're finishing way ahead of us and making us start over. So what would you suggest?" Tyler hesitated, apparently not having thought beyond his initial complaint. Marcus Thompson, who had been quietly observing the dynamics, spoke up instead. "She's not the problem. We are. We're not working together, we're not helping each other, and we're not learning from our mistakes." It was the first sign of real insight from any of the cadets, and Sarah made note of it as she considered how to proceed with the training program. Marcus had identified the core issue: they were approaching the challenge as individuals competing against each other rather than as a team working toward a common goal. "Exactly," Sarah said. "Physical strength alone isn't enough to complete this course under these conditions. You need teamwork, communication, and mutual support. More importantly, you need to understand that real strength often means helping others succeed rather than trying to prove your own superiority." The next attempt showed marginal improvement as the cadets began to offer each other assistance and encouragement. Jackson Mills, swallowing his pride, accepted help from Michael Rodriguez on a particularly challenging rope climb. David Williams stayed back to encourage Kevin O'Brien when the younger cadet was struggling with exhaustion. James Patterson shared water with Robert Chen when it became clear that proper hydration was essential for maintaining performance. Sarah continued to set the pace, but she also began providing more direct coaching on technique and strategy. She showed them how to distribute pack weight more efficiently, how to approach obstacles as a team rather than as individuals, and how to maintain energy and morale during extended physical challenges. Most importantly, she demonstrated by example what it looked like when someone with genuine expertise chose to use their capabilities to help others succeed rather than to dominate or intimidate them. By the eighth attempt, the team was beginning to function effectively. They had developed communication patterns, mutual support strategies, and a shared understanding of what success required. Jackson Mills had evolved from trying to command the group to actually leading it, focusing on problem-solving and team coordination rather than personal glory. Marcus Thompson had become the team's tactical thinker, analyzing their failures and developing strategies for improvement. The breakthrough came on the 10th attempt when they finally completed the entire course together. The sense of accomplishment was visible in every cadet's face, but Sarah could see that the real victory was in how they had achieved it. They had learned to function as a team, to support each other through difficulties, and to measure success in terms of collective achievement rather than individual dominance. Congratulations, Sarah said as they gathered at the finish line, all of them exhausted but exhilarated. You've just completed your first lesson in what real strength looks like. Physical capability is important, but it's meaningless without the character and teamwork necessary to use it effectively. She looked around the group, noting the changes in their body language and the way they were relating to each other. The hostile tension that had characterized their interactions before was beginning to be replaced by something that might eventually develop into mutual respect and camaraderie. Tomorrow we'll move on to the next lesson, what real courage means, and why it has nothing to do with pointing weapons at people who can't defend themselves. As they walked back toward the academy buildings, Sarah observed the cadets' conversations and interactions. They were discussing the obstacles they had overcome, the techniques they had learned, and the strategies they wanted to try in future training sessions. More importantly, they were talking to each other as teammates rather than competitors, showing genuine interest in each other's welfare and performance. The transformation was still in its early stages, and Sarah knew that changing deeply held attitudes and behaviors would require sustained effort over an extended period. But the foundation was being laid for the kind of character development that could eventually turn these 8 problematic cadets into effective military officers. Jackson Mills approached her as they neared the main building. "Lieutenant Martinez," he said, his tone formal but respectful, "I want to apologize for yesterday. We were wrong, and there's no excuse for what we did." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus simple expedience. What she saw was a young man who was beginning to understand the gap between his assumptions and reality, someone who was perhaps ready to learn lessons that would make him a better person as well as a better soldier. "Apologies are a good start," she replied. "But the real test will be whether you can learn from the experience and make different choices in the future. Tomorrow we'll find out how committed you are to that growth." As she watched the cadets head toward their dormitory, Sarah reflected on the day's progress. The physical training had served its immediate purpose of demonstrating alternative concepts of strength and teamwork, but she knew the real challenges lay ahead. Changing behavior was relatively easy compared to changing character, and character transformation required confronting not just wrong actions but wrong thinking. The next phase of their education would be far more difficult, both for the cadets and for herself. She would need to guide them through experiences that challenged their fundamental assumptions about leadership, courage, and moral responsibility. The stakes were high, because the kind of officers these young men became would eventually be responsible for the lives and welfare of the soldiers under their command. But, for the first time since the incident began, Sarah felt optimistic about the outcome. The cadets had demonstrated that they were capable of growth and learning when properly motivated and guided. The question now was whether that capacity for change extended to the deeper issues of character and judgment that would determine their fitness for military leadership. 3 months after the incident that had changed everything, Sarah stood at the back of the Blackwater Academy auditorium watching the 8 cadets she had taken under her wing deliver presentations to their fellow students about leadership, ethics, and military values. The transformation in their confidence, bearing, and understanding of what it meant to be a soldier was remarkable to anyone who had known them before, but Sarah was particularly focused on the subtle changes that indicated real character development rather than mere behavioral compliance. Jackson Mills stood at the podium addressing a group of first-year cadets about the dangers of prejudice and assumptions in military decision-making. His presentation was structured around case studies from actual military operations where commanders' preconceptions about gender, race, or background had led to tactical failures and unnecessary casualties. The young man who had once believed that physical intimidation was an appropriate tool for asserting authority was now speaking eloquently about the importance of evaluating people based on their capabilities and character rather than their appearance or demographics. "One of the most important lessons I've learned this year," Jackson was saying, "is that real strength has nothing to do with the ability to make others afraid of you. Real strength is about making the people around you stronger, more capable, and more confident. It's about building teams that can accomplish things no individual could achieve alone, regardless of how physically imposing that individual might be." Sarah smiled as she listened to him speak. The words weren't just memorized talking points, they reflected a fundamental shift in how Jackson understood leadership and human relationships. The change had come through months of carefully designed experiences that challenged his assumptions and forced him to develop new ways of thinking about success and failure, strength and weakness, courage and fear. Marcus Thompson was presenting to a different group about the ethical dimensions of military service, focusing on the responsibility officers bear for the welfare and development of their subordinates. His presentation drew heavily on philosophical and historical sources, but it was grounded in practical examples and real-world scenarios that made abstract principles relevant to daily military life. The moment you accept authority over other people, Marcus was explaining, you become responsible not just for completing missions, but for ensuring that the people under your command become better soldiers and better human beings through their service. That's not something you can accomplish through intimidation or by demanding blind obedience. It requires understanding, patience, and a genuine commitment to helping others reach their potential. The sophistication of Marcus's understanding surprised even Sarah, who had recognized his intellectual potential from the beginning of their unconventional training program. He had not only absorbed the lessons she had tried to teach but had expanded on them through his own research and reflection. More importantly, he had begun to demonstrate the kind of moral imagination that distinguished truly effective leaders from mere managers. The other 6 cadets were similarly engaged in various aspects of the Academy's educational program, but their involvement went far beyond completing assigned tasks. Kevin O'Brien had become a mentor for younger cadets who were struggling with the physical demands of military training, using his own initial difficulties as a way to connect with and encourage others. Tyler Brooks and James Patterson had developed a peer counseling program for cadets dealing with homesickness and adjustment issues. David Williams had shown unexpected aptitude for tactical analysis and was working with the Academy's Strategic Studies Department on research projects related to urban warfare and counterinsurgency operations. Michael Rodriguez had become involved in the Academy's community outreach programs, organizing volunteer activities and building relationships between the military and civilian communities. Robert Chen was pursuing advanced studies in military history and international relations, with particular focus on how military organizations adapt to changing social and technological environments. The comprehensive nature of their development reflected the approach Sarah had taken to their rehabilitation. Rather than simply punishing them for their misconduct or trying to correct specific behavioral problems, she had focused on helping them understand the deeper principles and values that should guide military service. The process had been intensive and sometimes difficult, requiring them to confront not just their actions but the thinking patterns and assumptions that had led to those actions. The transformation hadn't happened overnight or without resistance. There had been moments when individual cadets had balked at the demands being placed on them, times when they had argued that the standards Sarah was setting were unrealistic or unfair. Jackson Mills in particular had struggled with accepting feedback and criticism, having grown up in an environment where his opinions and preferences were rarely challenged. But Sarah had persisted with a combination of firmness and patience that gradually wore down their resistance and opened them to new ways of thinking. She had drawn on her own experiences in special operations training, where personal transformation was understood to be as important as technical skill development. The techniques used to forge elite soldiers could be adapted to develop character and judgment in young officers, provided they were applied with skill and consistency. One of the most powerful tools in Sarah's rehabilitation program had been exposure to real military veterans who could share authentic experiences and perspectives. She had arranged for the cadets to spend time with wounded warriors at local VA hospitals, to participate in support programs for military families, and to volunteer with organizations serving homeless veterans. These experiences had provided concrete examples of service and sacrifice that made abstract discussions of military values personally meaningful. The cadets had also been required to complete extensive research projects on military history, focusing particularly on examples of moral courage and ethical decision-making under pressure. They had studied leaders like Harriet Tubman, who had served as a Union spy and scout during the Civil War, and more recent figures like Captain Kristen Griest and First Lieutenant Shea Haver, the first women to complete Army Ranger School. These assignments had challenged their preconceptions about gender and capability while providing positive role models for leadership and service. Perhaps most importantly, Sarah had insisted that the cadets take responsibility for addressing the broader cultural problems at Blackwater Academy that had enabled their misconduct in the first place. Working together, they had developed and implemented programs to combat hazing, improve respect and inclusion for female cadets, and create more positive approaches to military socialization and tradition. The impact of their efforts was visible throughout the academy. Incidents of misconduct and harassment had decreased significantly, while measures of morale and cohesion among the cadet corps had improved markedly. The 8 former troublemakers had become some of the most respected and effective student leaders on campus, sought out by their peers for advice and guidance on both personal and academic matters. The success of Sarah's approach had also attracted attention from military education experts and policymakers at the highest levels. Representatives from the Pentagon had visited Blackwater to observe her training methods and consider how they might be applied more broadly throughout military education systems. Several other academies had requested that she consult on their own character development and leadership training programs. But Sarah's focus remained on the individual young people whose lives she had been able to influence. As she watched Jackson Mills conclude his presentation to enthusiastic applause from his audience, she reflected on the journey they had all taken together. The angry, prejudiced young man who had pointed a weapon at her just 3 months earlier had become someone capable of inspiring and educating others about the very values he had once rejected. After the presentations were complete, all 8 cadets gathered around Sarah in the auditorium lobby. Their relationship had evolved from student and instructor to something more complex and meaningful, a combination of mentorship, friendship, and mutual respect that would likely continue long after their time at Blackwater ended. Lieutenant Martinez, Jackson said, speaking for the group, "We wanted to thank you again for giving us a second chance when we didn't deserve it. More than that, thank you for showing us what we were capable of becoming when we stopped limiting ourselves to what we thought we already knew." Sarah looked around the group, noting the changes in their posture, their expressions, and the way they related to each other and to her. These were no longer the same young men who had attempted to intimidate her with weapons and crude displays of dominance. They had become something much more valuable, potential leaders who understood that real authority came from character rather than position, from service rather than self-interest. "You don't need to thank me," she replied. "You did the hard work of changing yourselves. I just provided some guidance and held you accountable for living up to your potential. The real test will be how you use what you've learned when you become officers and have responsibility for other people's lives and development." Marcus Thompson nodded thoughtfully. "That's what we've been talking about among ourselves. How do we make sure we don't fall back into old patterns when we're under pressure? How do we stay committed to these principles when it might be easier or more convenient to compromise them?" It was exactly the kind of question Sarah had hoped they would be asking themselves. Character development wasn't a one-time achievement but an ongoing process that required constant attention and reinforcement. The fact that they were already thinking about how to maintain their growth and continue improving suggested that the changes were genuine and likely to be permanent. "The answer is the same as it is for any other kind of training," Sarah explained. "You practice consistently, you seek out challenges that test your skills and values, and you surround yourself with people who will hold you accountable for living up to your standards. Most importantly, you remember that leadership is always about serving something larger than yourself." As she prepared to leave the academy for her next assignment, Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction about what had been accomplished. The incident that had brought them all together could have resulted in 8 young men being expelled from military service before their careers had even begun. Instead, it had become an opportunity for transformation that would benefit not just those individuals but everyone they would lead and serve throughout their military careers. The 8 cadets who had once pointed weapons at her had learned the most important lesson of military service, that real strength comes not from the ability to dominate others, but from the willingness to sacrifice for others, to serve causes greater than oneself, and to help other people become the best versions of themselves. They had discovered that true courage wasn't about being unafraid, but about doing what was right even when it was difficult or dangerous. Most importantly, they had learned that respect could never be demanded or taken by force. It could only be earned through consistent demonstration of competence, character, and commitment to the welfare of others. These lessons would serve them well as they continued their development as military officers and as human beings. As Sarah walked across the Blackwater Academy campus one final time, she knew that her work there was complete. The 8 young men who had once seen her as an obstacle to be overcome had become allies in the ongoing effort to make military service more inclusive, more effective, and more worthy of the sacrifices made by those who choose to serve their country. The ripple effects of their transformation would continue to spread long after she had moved on to new challenges and new opportunities to make a difference. The story that had begun with hostility and prejudice had ended with understanding and growth. It was a reminder that even the most difficult people and situations could be transformed through patience, skill, and an unwavering commitment to helping others reach their potential. For Sarah Martinez, it had been just another day at the office, but for 8 young men and countless others they would influence throughout their careers, it had been the beginning of a lifetime of better choices and more effective service.